At Five Star Bank, community is at the heart of what we do. Every day we strive to have thoughtful solutions for our customers and help our communities prosper. Honest dialogue about the issues affecting the region is vitally important to that prosperity. We are proud to be part of the conversation and hope you'll join in.
In our first season of Studio Sacramento, Leah Albright-byrd joined us as a part of a discussion to put the neglected horror of sex trafficking on the local and national radar as a priority issue. Leah helped lead the fight in California to pass Proposition 35, an initiative putting in place the strongest public sanctions in the country to combat sex trafficking. She led that fight from a place of authenticity, having once been trafficked herself, and escaping that environment in order to bear witness to the countless thousands trapped in a system of pain, violence, and desperation. Leah is the founder and executive director of Bridgets Dream and joins us again to share her journey from sex trafficking survivor to advocate. Leah, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
What's changed in the past 2 years since we last got together?
Well, Scott, a lot has changed. Things have changed nationally. They've changed in our state. My organization, Bridgets Dream, has definitely evolved in its capacity to serve and meet the need locally. Well, we've been able to acquire some very strategic partnerships with other organizations in the community, and we continue to get more and more referrals for girls and women that have been exploited, which lets us know that there's an increase in identification of those victims, which is exciting for us. It doesn't necessarily mean that the problem has grown exponentially, but it does mean that our community's seeing these victims and then referring them to us. And then lastly, I feel like I've evolved. I started off really passionate about the local issue and have over the last 2 years become a national advocate around the issue of human trafficking, and now soon to be an international advocate.
Yeah, well, you have a trip coming up. What's that?
I do. I'm actually leaving for England tomorrow, and I will be there for about 9 days training England's first long-term safe house for human trafficking survivors there. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Wow. Now, is trafficking in England as significant an issue as it is here in the United States?
It is not as significant an issue. However, it is another industrialized country, and wherever you have children, you have vulnerable children. So it's something that the United Kingdom definitely wants to be responsive to.
And in terms of California itself, has, with the passage of the proposition, has the flow of people being trafficked diminished, or is it the same?
I think it's too soon for us to say. I think we've just started to move in a direction of data gathering around this issue, especially with law enforcement. But what I can say is that we've had an increase in convictions under Prop 35, and the law enforcement training for the statewide training has been fully developed and is being launched. So our law enforcement officers across the state are being educated around the issue.
Now, some of us who this is their first time meeting you don't know your story. Tell us a little bit about your journey.
Sure. So I, like most youth that are vulnerable to being preyed on by predators, had come from an environment that was marked by trauma and dysfunction. There's a lot of brokenness in my family, and before I ever ran away from home and became a human trafficking victim, I was a survivor of domestic violence. I had grown up in a home where there was substance abuse, and so by the time I was 14, I was searching desperately for love and acceptance and belonging, and completely oblivious to the fact that there were predators in my community that would prey on my vulnerabilities, like so many of the children that I now have the opportunity to work with. And so my exploitation lasted from 14 to 18. I met a guy that was selling drugs here in Sacramento, and like so many drug traffickers, he turned to the trafficking in human beings because he felt like it was more lucrative and less risky for him criminally. And so my exploitation, like I said, it lasted for 4 years, and it was, definitely one of the worst seasons of my life.
And you have an interesting insight into why trafficking in humans can be more attractive than the drug trade itself. Can you share that with us again?
Sure. So when you're selling drugs, you have circumstantial evidence, right? You have evidence. If you get pulled over in a car and you have substances in your car, then you're automatically being taken to jail. If you get pulled over in your vehicle and you have a couple of girls who are underage who you probably have dressed up and made them look like they're older, and you've developed an allegiance and loyalty with them either through fear or manipulation and coercion, they're less likely to tell on you. And so prosecutors will tell you that traffickers are some of the hardest criminals to prosecute because of those very factors. But now with the passing of Prop 35, a minor doesn't necessarily have to be in the courtroom to testify. It's just given us a lot more opportunity to prosecute.
Remind us, what are the tools of Prop 35 that have changed the landscape in California?
Absolutely. So with the passing of Proposition 35, it increased the penalties against human traffickers so that when force, fraud, or coercion is used with a minor, that trafficker is facing 15 to life in the state of California. It also mandated law enforcement training throughout the state so that we can make sure that all of our officers are aware of this human trafficking issue. And there's one facet of Prop 35 that's unfortunately being held up in the Supreme Court, and that was the disclosing of all email and internet accounts by registered sex offenders.
This is this issue about the phones. If it's on your phone, there's a dispute as to whether it's protected by a privacy claim, right?
No, that's a little bit different. It's more so the Supreme Court, the initial argument was that it was a violation of their First Amendment rights, and they basically have to disclose so much about themselves. So I personally don't understand what the big deal is about email and internet accounts, especially when we have such a huge issue with internet exploitation in children. So,
let's go back to the night that the proposition passed.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
What was that like? What was that moment like for you?
So it was a bunch of things, Scott. I mean, for one, we were watching it alongside the presidential election, so waiting to see whether or not Obama was being reelected, and then waiting to see how we would do. And then to see that we broke state record with 81.3% of voter support.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, that was the highest rate of voter support, highest amount of voter support in the history of the state of California. So to see Californians be so invested in protecting children and invested in addressing the human trafficking issue for me as a survivor was just overwhelming. And I remember looking at the founder of California Against Slavery, the organization that started this whole campaign, and she and I literally were laughing and crying at the same time. So it was one of those, joy-filled moments that...
Validating?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And you look back on the tapestry of your life, I look back and go, wow, look at all of the things that I've experienced to get to this moment. And I've officially, through my involvement and through the support of all of the Californians and the people that invested their time and their money into that campaign, we've left a legacy for children in our state, and that was a powerful moment.
Connect that to your friend Bridget and Bridgets Dream.
Sure.
When you were in that moment,
mm-hmm.
did she ever come into your mind?
Absolutely. So one of the campaign tools that was used was a picture of her and two other young ladies who'd been trafficked, and to realize that her picture and her story had been spread across the state in a way that I know I could have never. It was the people who were promoting this campaign. But, I don't know that the pain of losing Bridget will ever go away completely, but in those moments when you see that such amazing things are happening as a result of her story and as a result of me having the opportunity to share that story, it's just profound.
Was there ever an amazing thing or moment that happened during the campaign when you knew that you had turned the corner and yes, this is going to happen?
Yeah, there were quite a few. I think honestly my first press conference with Prop 35.
Really?
Yes, because I saw the Congresswoman Jackie Speer there, and Chris Kelly, who's one of my heroes, he's one of the owners with the Kings now, go Kings, and You know, but being in the presence of people who were really, really invested and seeing the momentum, I just had this moment where I thought, we're going to do this. We're really going to do this. Especially because there were so many other things happening across the country that were really pushing us as a state in that direction. So,
and how has this, the passage of this proposition and the fight that you're leading, how has that resonated in other parts of the country?
Well, I mean, California is an incredibly powerful and influential state, and I think there were states that were waiting for us to catch up.
Really?
Yes. So the Polaris Project is an national organization, and so they basically do report cards for states, and California had received an F compared to some of the other states that were implementing things like safe harbor laws. And so now we've been able to catch up. I mean, you'd think that we would have been at the forefront, and we weren't. And so I think the rest of the country is very excited about that, especially because we house 3 of the nation's top highest trafficking cities.
When we last got together, one of the things that you spoke about was the need for officer training, which is a part of the proposition, but it had to do with essentially deconstructing not only behavior and giving people new behaviors, officers, but also taking down some of their assumptions that led them to effectively value the trafficked less than other victims that they might see. How do you think that with the passage, how will we know if the passage of Prop 35 is working?
Right. Well, one of the ways that we'll know that it's working is the number of prosecutions. So before, we were getting, unfortunately, traffickers with slaps on the wrist, especially when it came to minors. I mean, that was the biggest focus of Prop 35. I think to speak to the other point that you mentioned with law enforcement, what we're really looking at, not just with law enforcement, but with our state and our country, is a cultural shift in perspective around this issue.
Yes.
To where we stop saying, oh, just those prostitutes, right? To, wait a minute, these are children. The average age of entry is 12 to 14. That's a junior high or high school student. And so I'm excited to be able to share that I actually am one of the subject matter experts on the statewide law enforcement training and helped to develop that training. And a big part of that education piece is helping them understand victimology. So when you have a victim that doesn't present like a victim, then naturally you're not going to feel inclined to protecting this person if they're aggressive and abrasive. But once you understand the backstory and you understand how they're being groomed, how they've been recruited and manipulated to respond the way that they are, then it starts to shift your perspective.
Groomed, what's that?
Well, unfortunately, when a trafficker targets a victim, he begins to manipulate her, and it's not very difficult when you have a child whose brain isn't fully developed. So you have a 12-year-old, you can tell a 12-year-old anything. And that power dynamic with you as an adult, this trafficker is an adult exploiting this child, that child is continuing to learn and to develop and embracing those beliefs that that person is trying to get him or her to believe. So it's very hardwired, right? I mean, just like I'm sure you can think of things that your parents told you that you can hear them saying in your head.
Never leaves.
Right. So then when you're 12 years old and the streets are raising you in essence, and you have someone who's very unhealthy and at times psychopathic because they're not showing empathy or compassion towards their victims, you start to really believe what you're being told.
You also mentioned that there was an ethnic dimension to this problem, and that disproportionately women of color and African American women in California have been involved in trafficking. And I'm wondering, how goes the effort to engage those communities in being better identifiers and supporters of getting victims out of that life?
Right. Well, that's one of the things that Bridgets Dream is actually focused on. We just did, for example, a presentation with San Joaquin Delta College last week with their African American history students, wanting to influence the next generation of leaders and helping them understand the disproportionate impact in low-income communities and in communities with women of color. And so we continue to educate our community as much as we can, and probably about 85% of the girls that we're working with identify as either being African American or of African American descent, which is alarming for us. And so we've been discussing with some professors and other professionals, African American professionals, therapists that are interested in this, to begin to talk about how can we raise awareness on a broader scale so that our communities of color are being educated and they're aware of their vulnerabilities.
Is there receptivity to receiving this type of training?
Absolutely. I think, see, the unique thing about, and I can only speak for the Black community because that's the community that I represent, right? We still have this kind of, those are just those fast little girls, kind of old school thought process around it, which parallels a lot with our perspective of mental health and whether or not we feel like it's taboo to get counseling support. So there's a lot of—
You're soft if you do that.
Right, right. And there's a lot of relationship building that has to take place. I think the beautiful thing is that I, as an African American person, can go into my community and pull some coattails, so to speak. You know, I can bring up things that
make people come correct, right?
Right, right. That might be uncomfortable for other people to mention, and we can have some open, honest conversations about this. And as we do, I've seen people go, yeah, I have. You'd be amazed. I don't know, either amazed or shocked or horrified at how many people within communities of color have been impacted by human trafficking.
Wow.
Not just because our ancestors were human trafficking survivors, right? But because it continues to touch our communities in ways that I think we haven't even begun to address.
Wow. Wow. So you've been on this journey and all of these things have happened and you've impacted events and lives. How have they impacted you?
That's a great question, Scott. So I thought that I was going to be able to inoculate myself better from relationships with the girls that we serve. And let me clarify, that's not to say that I don't want to have intimate relationships with them, but you have to have good boundaries when you're working in the mental health field, right? And that's for the sake of self-care. But I realized that some of that inoculation is tied to my fear of loss, right? So when Bridget was murdered, and I felt in many ways personally responsible because I recruited her when I was 15, there was something that happened in my heart where I wanted to fight, and at the same time it produced an overwhelming amount of fear. And so with the love and the resiliency that I see in the girls that we work with, there's no way not to love these girls. There's no way not to get close and attached to them. And we do life together. You know, they come to events, and we can't keep
We do life together.
And that's the only solution to any brokenness, really, whether it's human trafficking or substance abuse. It's relationship. And so we get to live our lives together and grow together. So I know I've definitely grown. I've been forced to look at areas where I still need to heal as a result of the work that I do, and it's just all good in the end. So
I'm curious, this movement that you were part of the birthing has grown, and before it came into itself and the proposition passed, it was a group of very committed, dedicated individuals, and now it's got organizations and structures and you know, all of the accoutrements of being institutionalized. And the cynic in me wonders, though, whether or not when something grows from a movement into a cottage industry, whether or not exploitation happens again under another name.
And that's a great point you bring up. And I think before I address that, I have to say, you know, I have been a part of this movement, but there are people that have gone before me that have made what's happening now possible. And that's people like Dr. Lois Lee, the founder of Children of the Night, an organization that's been around since the 70s. That's Rachel Lloyd, the founder of GEMS in New York, an organization that's been around since the 90s, and Nola Brantley. And I mean, there's so many people that I can look to, and a lot of them are survivors that have pioneered and put their lives on display for the world to see so that we can experience the change that we're now experiencing. And so I just get to be a part of that, right? But to speak to your point, what I've seen is a lot of re-exploitation, unfortunately, because there's such a push for survivor involvement, which I'm I'm very happy about. And at the same time, if girls and women and men that have been exploited are not being educated on how to share their stories without re-traumatizing themselves, because that's very possible, and they're not being educated on how to interact with the media, right? Then next thing you know, you face a new form of slavery, kind of like in the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, right? Where instead of being exploited sexually, now your story's being exploited for the sake of the development of an organization. And so with Bridgets Dream, I'm really sensitive to that as the leader. We've had a lot of survivors get involved and want to serve. And the question is always, do you understand what the ramifications are of you sacrificing this part of yourself and sharing it? Because I know for myself, the most intimate parts of my life are now public display.
Yes.
Right? And so you really have to be at a place where you're emotionally and psychologically prepared for that. And I don't think that I was initially. So we want to keep that from happening. But unfortunately, like you mentioned, it does happen.
So what's the next big goal for the movement itself?
That's a great question. I'm excited that you asked that. So there are 2 bills on the books right now that actually just passed appropriations, and one is a Senate bill that will mandate sexual abuse and sexual trauma education in all of the junior high and high schools in the state of California, which is really, really exciting. That's a huge preventative effort that I believe our community will benefit from for years to come, as long as we're able to get it passed. Is
there opposition?
There's no opposition, but you know, I mean, you never know what can happen.
The legislature is like Forrest Gump's box of chocolates.
Right. You never know what you're going to get. That's right. So the other bill that I'm really excited about is a demand bill to address the demand side. And so we can continue to provide victim services and we can continue to prosecute traffickers, but if we're not preventing and educating our community, and if we're not addressing the demand, which is a basic economic principle, demand and supply, right? Supply and demand. And so that demand bill will increase the penalties against sex buyers, and it will require them to experience a mandatory confinement and fines and potentially education wherever a first offenders program is available in the state.
And I don't know, I'm not in law enforcement, I don't know if this is true, but one of the things that I had heard was that prior to the passage of this proposition, the consequences were actually more severe for a DUI than it was for being a sex buyer. Absolutely, unfortunately. Well, not Prop 35. Prop 35 focused primarily on traffickers. This new Senate bill that's just been, like I said, just passed appropriations, that will change that dynamic. So we had an incident recently where a young lady was referred to us, and her story actually made the news locally, where the sex buyer that was arrested during that sting received a slap on the wrist and a ticket and was on his way. We cannot continue to allow that to happen to people who are buying children in our community. Now, with your advocacy, not only here in California, but nationally, now going internationally, and the fact that your life has been exposed in service of this movement, completely, you put it all out there, and you're in the forefront of trying to protect the victims and get them safe. Do you ever worry about your own safety? Because you're so visible, and for those for whom this is their business, you're disrupting their income and their livelihood. I have had moments where I've thought about it, probably not as much as people would think, primarily because of wherein my faith lies around this situation. And then the other part is I have some very strong connections with law enforcement and a lot of support with the FBI, and we do take safety measures around my involvement in certain things. For example, we had an incident where a trafficker got a hold of my phone number and called about 25 times trying to locate the girl that we helped rescue. We helped her escape. Excuse me, I don't even like the word rescue, but we helped her escape from that situation. And he called repeatedly, and then eventually I was able to tell him, you know, we have FBI affiliations, we know your name. He stopped calling. But I'm very well aware that it could be worse. But it's just not something that I spend a lot of time focused on. Okay. In our final moments, tell us what's next for Leah Albright-byrd. Where is she in the future?
Right. Thanks for asking that. So my big focus going forward is writing a book. And one of the things that I've realized as I've traveled and spoken at different places and spoken to a wide variety of audiences and age ranges is that the common theme is healing for people. I've had people that have not been through the same thing that I've experienced reach out to me and say, hey, how were you able to forgive? How were you able to heal? What treatment worked well for you? And I want to be able to share that part of my life with people that haven't necessarily experienced the same thing and give them hope so that they know that it's possible to grow and move forward.
Well, maybe that becomes the next visit, where it is that you can share that piece of work when it's complete.
Sure.
All right. Well, thank you, Leah.
Thank you.
And good luck and safe travels.
Thank you.
All right. And that's our show. Thanks to our guest and thanks to you for watching Studio Sacramento. I'm Scott Syfax. See you next time right here on KVIE.
At Five Star Bank, community is at the heart of what we do. Every day we strive to have thoughtful solutions for our customers and help our communities prosper. Honest dialogue about the issues affecting the region is vitally important to that prosperity. We are proud to be part of the conversation and hope you'll join in.
All episodes of Studio Sacramento, along with other KVIE programs, are available to watch online at kvie.org/video.